The crystal chandelier in the Blackwell family dining room cast fractured light across the mahogany table as Margaret Blackwell slid the thick legal document across the polished surface toward me. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the wood while her cold gray eyes assessed my reaction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Nothing personal, dear, she said, her voice carrying that particular brand of condescension I'd grown accustomed to over the past 18 months. It's simply good business. The Blackwell name comes with certain responsibilities. I stared down at the prenuptial agreement, its pages dense with legal language designed to protect Marcus's inheritance from what his mother clearly viewed as a gold-digging threat. The irony was so thick I could taste it, but I kept my expression neutral, playing the role I'd perfected since meeting Marcus at that coffee shop near Columbia 2 years ago. Of course, I murmured, picking up the document with appropriately trembling fingers. I understand completely. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside me, his hand finding mine under the table. Even he didn't know the truth about who I really was. To him, I was still Emma Chen, the struggling graduate student who worked double shifts at the campus bookstore to pay for textbooks and ramen noodles. Mother, maybe we could discuss this privately first, Marcus began, but Margaret cut him off with a wave of her diamond-encrusted hand. Nonsense. Emma's practically family now. She should hear this directly from me. Margaret's smile was all teeth and no warmth. You see, dear, the Blackwell fortune has been carefully preserved for 5 generations. Marcus will inherit approximately $37 million, plus the family properties in the Hamptons, Manhattan, and Martha's Vineyard, I nodded dutifully, maintaining my wide-eyed expression of awe. Inside, I was calculating that Marcus's inheritance was less than 3 times what I'd had access to since my 21st birthday 6 months ago. But Margaret didn't need to know that my trust fund, established by my late grandmother's tech fortune, currently sat at just over $15 million. The prenup is quite straightforward, Margaret continued, settling back into her chair like a queen holding court. In the unfortunate event of divorce, Emma would receive a modest settlement, enough to maintain dignity, nothing more. We simply cannot risk fortune hunters attempting to claim what generations of Blackwells have built. The word fortune hunter hit exactly as intended, and I let a slight flush creep up my neck. Marcus squeezed my hand tighter, and I could see the conflict in his blue eyes. He loved me. I knew that much was genuine. But he'd never been strong enough to stand up to his mother's manipulations. The terms seem comprehensive, I said quietly, flipping through pages that detailed exactly how little I would receive should our marriage fail. The settlement proposed was laughably small, $200,000 and no claim to any properties or business interests. I'm so glad you understand, Margaret purred. Too many young women today have unrealistic expectations about marriage to successful men. They think love conquers all, when really it's about compatibility of circumstances. She gestured around the opulent dining room with its priceless art collection and antique furniture. Everything was designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of their place in the social hierarchy. The Blackwells had old money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted, but Margaret had never learned the difference. When would you like me to sign? I asked, playing perfectly into her expectations. Well, there's no rush, Margaret said, though her eagerness was obvious. Perhaps you'd like to take it home, look it over? Though I should mention that Marcus and I discussed this, and we both feel it's best to finalize these details before the engagement party next month. The engagement party. 200 of the Blackwells' closest friends and business associates, all eager to meet Marcus's mysterious fiancé. I'd been dreading it for weeks, knowing it would be an exercise in subtle humiliation as Margaret showcased my supposed inadequacies to their social circle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mother," Marcus said again, his voice strained. "Emma doesn't need to decide right now." "Of course not," Margaret agreed, but her eyes never left my face. "Though I do hope you understand, dear, that this is simply how these things are done in our world. Prenuptials are as common as wedding cakes among people of our standing. Our world. Our standing." The words were carefully chosen to remind me that I didn't belong, that I was an outsider being granted temporary access to their rarefied atmosphere. If only she knew that my own family's wealth dwarfed theirs, built on the kind of new money that actually understood discretion. My grandmother, Jennifer Chang, had been one of the earliest investors in what would become Google, Apple, and Amazon. She'd had the foresight to see the digital revolution coming, and the wisdom to diversify her investments across emerging technologies. By the time she died when I was 19, she'd amassed a fortune that made the Blackwells look like middle-class suburbanites playing dress-up. But I'd learned early to keep that information private. My parents, both academics who'd inherited my grandmother's love of simplicity over ostentation, had raised me to understand that true wealth was meant to be invisible. We lived modestly, drove sensible cars, and valued education over exhibition. When I'd met Marcus at that coffee shop, I'd been genuinely attracted to his kindness and intelligence. He was completing his MBA while I worked on my master's in art history, and our conversations about literature and philosophy had drawn me in. The fact that he came from money hadn't mattered to me one way or another. I'd dated plenty of wealthy men whose trust funds couldn't compensate for their empty personalities. But Marcus had been different, or so I'd thought. He'd seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams, not just my appearance or availability. When he'd mentioned his family's wealth casually, almost apologetically, I'd found it refreshing compared to the men who opened conversations by describing their car collections. Now, 18 months later, I was beginning to see that Marcus's diffidence about money wasn't humility. It was weakness. He'd never learned to stand up to his mother's financial manipulations because he'd never had to. Everything in his life, from his Ivy League education to his position at his father's investment firm, had been handed to him with the expectation that he'd eventually marry appropriately and continue the family legacy. "I should probably have my own lawyer look this over," I said carefully, knowing it would trigger exactly the response I expected. Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, though I hope you understand that our lawyers are quite thorough. The terms are standard for agreements of this type. Having it reviewed might simply delay the process unnecessarily." Translation: she was hoping I couldn't afford legal representation and would simply sign whatever she put in front of me. The assumption was so insulting it took genuine effort not to laugh. "I'm sure Emma will want to be completely comfortable with everything," Marcus said, finally showing a spine. "There's no need to rush." "Naturally," Margaret agreed, though her tone suggested anything but understanding. "Though I do hope we can resolve this before the engagement party. It would be so awkward to announce your engagement while these details remain unfinished." The threat was subtle but clear. Sign the prenup or risk having the engagement announcement delayed or possibly canceled. She was counting on my supposed desperation to lock down Marcus's proposal, assuming I'd cave under the social pressure. "I understand completely," I said, folding the document and placing it in my purse. "I'll have someone review it this week." "Wonderful," Margaret said, rising from her chair with the satisfied air of someone who'd successfully completed a distasteful but necessary task. "Marcus, Why don't you walk Emma to her car? I believe she mentioned needing to get to work this evening. Another reminder of my supposedly humble circumstances. Margaret had never let me forget that I worked retail to support myself through graduate school, treating my employment like a character flaw rather than a choice. As Marcus walked me to my intentionally modest Honda Civic, my actual car was a BMW i8 parked in a private garage across town. I could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. "Emma, I'm sorry about all this," he said, leaning against the driver's side door. "Mother can be intense about family matters." "She's protecting what's important to her," I replied neutrally. "I can't fault her for that." "But the way she talks to you sometimes," Marcus continued, running his hands through his dark hair. "It's not right. You're going to be her daughter-in-law." I studied his face in the dim light of the street lamp, seeing the genuine conflict there. Marcus wasn't inherently cruel like his mother, but he was fundamentally weak. In 2 years of dating, I'd watched him consistently choose the path of least resistance, rather than stand up for his own beliefs or the people he claimed to love. "It's fine." "Marcus," I said, unlocking my car, "really, this is just how these things work in your family." "Our family," he corrected gently, kissing my forehead. "After we're married, it'll be our family too." I smiled and kissed him goodbye, playing the role of the grateful fiancé one more time. As I drove away, I caught sight of Margaret watching from the dining room window, her expression satisfied. She thought she'd handled the situation perfectly, put the gold digger in her place while maintaining plausible deniability about her motivations. The drive back to my actual apartment, not the cramped studio I'd shown Marcus, but a spacious 2-bedroom in an upscale building with a doorman, gave me time to process the evening's events. The prenup itself was laughably insulting, designed more to humiliate than protect. But it was also the perfect opportunity to reveal exactly how wrong Margaret's assumptions had been. My phone rang as I pulled into the parking garage, Marcus's name appearing on the screen. "Hey," I answered, genuinely curious about what he might say now that he was alone. "I just wanted to apologize again," he said, his voice tired. "Mother means well, but she can be overprotective about family finances." "She's looking out for your future," I replied diplomatically. I can't blame her for that. Still, the way she presented it was unnecessarily harsh. "You know I don't care about any of that prenup nonsense, right? I love you for who you are, not your bank account." The irony was almost painful. "I know, Marcus, and I love you too." "Good. Because none of that legal stuff matters to me. Whether you have money or not, whether your family has connections or not, none of it changes how I feel about you." After we hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes, thinking about the choices ahead of me. I could simply sign the prenup, marry Marcus, and reveal my financial situation after the wedding. It would be satisfying to watch Margaret's face when she realized her precious family fortune was actually the smaller pot in the marriage. But there was something appealing about the alternative, letting them continue their assumptions. Right up until the moment of maximum impact, the engagement party would be the perfect venue for such a revelation, with all their friends and business associates present to witness Margaret's reaction to learning that her future daughter-in-law was wealthier than her entire family. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Jonathan Rivers, from my real office. Not the cramped corner of the bookstore where Marcus thought I spent my days, but the sleek corporate suite where I managed my investments and philanthropic activities. "Emma," Jonathan's voice was warm through the speakerphone. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. How's the engagement going?" "Interestingly," I replied, scanning the prenup's terms on my computer screen, "I need you to review something Margaret Blackwell presented to me yesterday." Jonathan had handled my family's legal affairs for years, ever since taking over from his father who'd worked with my grandmother. He knew exactly who the Blackwells were. His firm had actually represented them in several business deals over the years. Though they'd never connected him to me. The mother-in-law wants protection, he said after I'd emailed him the document. This is actually quite insulting, Emma. The settlement terms are barely above what you'd get from an annulment. I know. The question is how to respond. Well, you could counter with your own terms. Demand full financial disclosure from Marcus, equal protection for your own assets, standard escalating settlement terms based on length of marriage. The usual things people with actual money include in these agreements. I considered that option, but it lacked the dramatic flair the situation seemed to demand. What if I just sign it as written? Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Emma, I can't recommend that. Even if you're wealthy enough to not care about the money, the terms are unconscionable. Any judge would throw this out in a real divorce proceeding. But it's legally binding if I sign willingly? Technically, yes. Though I'd argue duress if it ever came to court. Why are you asking? I explained my plan to Jonathan, who listened with the kind of professional silence that indicated he thought his client had lost her mind. So you want to sign a prenup that massively favors your husband's family, then reveal at your engagement party that you're actually wealthier than all of them combined? He summarized. Essentially, yes. And the point of this elaborate charade would be? I thought about Margaret's condescending smile, her casual cruelty disguised as family protection. The point would be teaching them that assumptions about people based on appearances can be very expensive mistakes. Jonathan sighed. I suppose there's no legal reason you can't sign a bad prenup if you want to. Though I'd insist on adding some language about full disclosure being required from both parties. What kind of disclosure? Standard stuff. Complete financial statements, all assets, debts, income sources. If they're demanding protection from a gold digger, they should be willing to prove they actually have gold worth digging for. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. And if they refuse to provide complete disclosure, then the prenup becomes void. Judges don't like one-sided agreements based on incomplete information. I could already imagine Margaret's reaction to being asked for detailed financial statements. The Blackwells' old money came with old pride. They'd be mortified at having to document their wealth like common nouveau riche. Draft the amendment, I told Jonathan, and make sure it requires disclosure of all sources of wealth, including family trusts, business interests, and inheritance expectations. This is going to ruffle some feathers. Emma? Good. It's about time someone challenged their assumptions. The next few days passed normally on the surface. I went to classes, worked my shifts at the bookstore, and played the role of the struggling graduate student. But underneath, I was orchestrating something much more complex. My private investigator, David Kim, delivered his preliminary report on the Blackwell family finances on Thursday morning. We met at a discreet coffee shop downtown, far from anywhere Marcus or his family might spot us. They're not as wealthy as they pretend, David said, sliding a thick folder across the table. The $37 million Marcus is supposed to inherit? That's mostly tied up in real estate that hasn't been properly appraised in years. The actual liquid assets are closer to $12 million, and a lot of that is leveraged. I flipped through the documents, noting the pattern of financial stress disguised by maintaining appearances. The Hamptons house had been mortgaged twice in the past decade. The Manhattan apartment was actually a rental, not owned as Margaret had implied. Even the Martha's Vineyard property was part of a complex trust arrangement that limited what Marcus would actually inherit. What about current income? I asked. Margaret receives dividends from some blue-chip investments and rental income from properties she actually owns. Total annual income is maybe $400,000. which sounds like a lot until you factor in the lifestyle they're trying to maintain. $400,000 a year. I made more than that from a single tech stock dividend payment. The Blackwells were comfortable, certainly upper class, but they weren't wealthy by modern standards. They were living on inherited capital and reputation, slowly spending down resources while pretending nothing had changed. And Marcus's position at his father's firm? David consulted his notes. He's a junior partner, but the firm itself is struggling. They lost 2 major clients last year, and several partners have left for larger companies. Marcus's salary is $85,000 plus bonuses that have been declining annually. The picture was becoming clearer. Marcus wasn't the catch his mother believed him to be. He was a young man from a fading family trying to maintain appearances while the financial foundation crumbled beneath them. The prenup wasn't just about protecting their wealth. It was about preventing anyone from discovering how little they actually had to protect. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking if I wanted to meet for lunch. I agreed, curious to see if his behavior had changed since the prenup conversation. We met at our usual spot, a small bistro near campus that fit my supposed budget. Marcus seemed nervous, fidgeting with his menu and avoiding direct eye contact. "Have you had a chance to look over those papers?" he asked finally. "I have. My lawyer is reviewing them now." "Your lawyer?" Marcus's surprise was genuine. "I didn't know you had one," another assumption. Because I worked retail and lived modestly, he'd assumed I couldn't afford legal representation. "Everyone should have legal advice for important documents," I said carefully. "Of course, it's just... This isn't exactly a complicated agreement. Mother's lawyers are very thorough. I'm sure they covered everything important." I studied his face, looking for signs that he understood how insulting his mother's terms were. But Marcus seemed genuinely puzzled by my caution, as if he couldn't imagine why I'd want independent legal advice before signing away any financial security. "Marcus, do you actually know what's in the prenup?" He shifted uncomfortably. "The basics. It protects family assets in case things don't work out between us. Did you know it gives me a maximum settlement of $200,000, regardless of how long we're married or what circumstances lead to a divorce?" Marcus's face flushed. "That seems reasonable. I mean, you're not marrying me for money, right?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications he didn't fully understand. Marcus genuinely believed that $200,000 was generous compensation for a failed marriage to a multimillionaire. He had no concept of what an equitable partnership might look like. "No," I said slowly. "I'm not marrying you for money." Relief flickered across his features. "Then the specific amounts don't matter, do they? It's just legal formalities to keep Mother happy." I realized then that Marcus wasn't just weak. He was willfully ignorant about the financial realities of marriage and partnership. He'd never had to think about money as anything other than something that appeared in his accounts monthly, enabling his lifestyle without effort or planning. "My lawyer wants to add some disclosure requirements," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "What kind of disclosure?" "Complete financial statements from both sides. If we're going to have a prenup, it should be based on complete information about both parties' assets and income." Marcus frowned. "That seems unnecessarily complicated. Mother isn't going to like having to provide detailed financial information to someone she barely knows. She barely knows me because she's never bothered to ask about my background or family," I pointed out. This would be an opportunity to correct that oversight. "Emma, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Just sign the prenup as written and we can move forward with planning the engagement party." His dismissive tone triggered something cold and calculating in my chest. Marcus wasn't just going along with his mother's manipulations. He was actively enabling them because they benefited him. He wanted a prenup that protected his supposed wealth while offering me nothing, because he genuinely believed I had nothing to contribute to the partnership. I'll have my lawyer send the amendments to your family's firm, I said, standing to leave. Emma? Wait! Marcus caught my arm gently. Please don't make this into a bigger issue than it needs to be. Mother is just being cautious because she cares about our family. And I'm just being cautious because I care about my future, I replied, pulling my arm free. If your mother can demand financial protection, so can I. As I walked away, I could feel Marcus's confusion radiating behind me. In his world, the person with less money was supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps the wealthy family offered. The idea that I might have my own assets worth protecting had literally never occurred to him. That evening, I sat in my real apartment, looking out at the city lights while sipping wine that cost more than Marcus made in a day. The prenup sat on my coffee table, its terms now laughably inadequate given what I knew about the Blackwell family's actual financial situation. My phone rang, Jonathan calling with an update. I sent the amendments to Morrison. Kessler and Associates, he reported. Margaret Blackwell's personal lawyer, actually. He seemed quite surprised by the disclosure requirements. What kind of surprised? The kind that suggests his clients haven't been entirely forthcoming about their financial situation. He asked for 2 weeks to prepare the documentation, 2 weeks to figure out how to present their declining fortune in the best possible light. It was exactly what I'd expected. Jonathan, I want you to prepare my own financial disclosure too. Complete and accurate. Emma, are you sure? Once they see your actual assets, they'll realize they've made a serious miscalculation. Yes, that's exactly what I want them to realize. And then what? You still plan to marry into this family after publicly humiliating them? It was a fair question. I thought about Marcus's dismissive attitude at lunch, his casual assumption that I should be grateful for whatever his family offered. I thought about Margaret's condescending smile and her casual cruelty disguised as protection. I'm not sure yet, I admitted, but I want them to understand exactly who they're dealing with before I make that decision. The next morning brought an unexpected call from Margaret herself, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. Emma, dear, I understand you've added some complications to our simple prenuptial agreement. Not complications, I replied pleasantly. Just standard disclosure requirements. Surely you want the agreement to be based on complete information. I hardly think my family's private financial affairs are relevant to protecting Marcus's inheritance from potential complications. The pause before potential complications was loaded with meaning. Margaret was trying to remind me of my place without saying anything actionable. On the contrary, I said, if Marcus's inheritance is substantial enough to require protection, then documenting its exact nature and value seems essential. Otherwise, how would we know what we're protecting? There was silence on the line, and I could practically hear Margaret's mind racing. She'd assumed I would sign whatever she put in front of me without question. The idea that I might demand reciprocal transparency had caught her completely off guard. This is highly unusual, she said finally. Is it? I would think most prenups involve full disclosure from both parties. Unless the Blackwell family has something to hide? It was a direct challenge, and we both knew it. Margaret could either provide the disclosure or explain why the family that insisted on financial protection wasn't willing to document what they were protecting. Of course we have nothing to hide, Margaret said stiffly. It's simply a matter of privacy. Our family's financial affairs are not typically discussed with outsiders. I won't be an outsider much longer, I reminded her gently. And if we're going to have a prenup, it should protect both families' interests equally. After we hung up, I couldn't help but smile. Margaret was trapped between her own demands for financial protection and her unwillingness to reveal the family's actual financial situation. She'd created the very problem she was trying to avoid. The engagement party was now 3 weeks away, and I could feel the momentum building toward a confrontation that would change everything. Margaret thought she was dealing with a gold digger who could be intimidated into submission. Marcus believed he was marrying a grateful graduate student who would be satisfied with whatever his family offered. Neither of them had any idea that the woman they were trying to manipulate was wealthier than their entire extended family combined. The revelation would shatter more than just their assumptions. It would force them to confront the ugliness of their own prejudices and the emptiness of their supposed superiority. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to my financial advisor. It was time to liquidate some investments and transfer funds to accounts that would show up clearly on my financial disclosure. When Margaret Blackwell saw the true extent of my wealth, I wanted the numbers to be absolutely undeniable. The game was about to begin in earnest, and I intended to win it completely. 2 weeks of careful orchestration followed Margaret's uncomfortable phone call. While she scrambled to prepare financial documentation that would justify her family's demand for protection, I methodically assembled the most comprehensive financial disclosure in the history of prenuptial agreements. My financial advisor, Patricia Wong, had worked with tech wealth for decades and understood the importance of presentation. She arrived at my apartment on a crisp October morning with 3 leather portfolios containing documentation that would have impressed the SEC. "This is thorough enough to qualify for a public stock offering," Patricia said, spreading the documents across my dining table. "Your tech stock dividends alone generate more monthly income than most people make in a year." I reviewed the summary sheet, noting how the numbers told the story of generational wealth built on vision and maintained through careful stewardship. Real estate holdings in Seattle, San Francisco, and New York. Diversified investment portfolios spanning technology, pharmaceuticals, and emerging energy markets. A private foundation with an endowment larger than some universities. "The trust fund valuation is current as of yesterday," Patricia continued. $15.3 million, though with the tech sector rally this quarter, it'll likely cross $16 million before your engagement party. The engagement party. 3 days away now, and Margaret still hadn't produced her family's financial disclosure. Jonathan had received increasingly frantic calls from her attorney, each requesting additional time to properly prepare the documentation. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking if I wanted to grab coffee before my supposed shift at the bookstore. I agreed, curious to see how the financial pressure was affecting him. We met at our usual cafe, but Marcus looked strained, his normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled. He ordered black coffee instead of his usual elaborate drink, a small economy that spoke volumes about the tension at home. "Mother's been stressed about this prenup situation," he said without preamble. "Her lawyers are saying your requirements are excessive for someone in your position." "My position?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "You know what I mean. You're a graduate student working retail. What assets could you possibly have that require this level of documentation?" The question hung between us, loaded with assumptions that had guided every interaction we'd ever had. Marcus had never asked about my family background, my previous relationships, or my plans beyond graduation. He'd simply accepted the surface narrative because it fit his expectations of what his fiancé should be. "You might be surprised," I said carefully. "Emma, please. Mother is already unhappy about the delay. If we can't resolve this prenup situation before the engagement party, she's talking about postponing the announcement." There it was, the threat Margaret had been building toward. Sign the insulting prenup immediately, or face public humiliation at their carefully planned social event. Would you postpone it? I asked, studying his face. Marcus's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I hope it doesn't come to that. But family harmony is important. And if Mother feels the legal details aren't properly settled, then maybe she should provide the financial disclosure she agreed to. It's complicated, Marcus said, running his hands through his hair. Our family's wealth isn't like other people's money. It's tied up in trusts and properties and business arrangements that go back generations. You can't just summarize it in a few documents. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Marcus was describing exactly the kind of complex financial web that required detailed documentation, while arguing that it was too complex to document. My lawyer says disclosure is mandatory for binding prenups, I replied. If your family's finances are too complicated to explain, maybe they're too complicated to protect with a simple agreement. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to the patronizing tone he probably didn't realize he was using. Emma, sweetheart, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. Just sign the prenup, marry me, and let Mother handle the family finances. You don't need to worry about money. I don't need to worry about money. Well, no. That's the whole point of marrying into a family like ours. Financial security. You can focus on your art history degree, maybe do some volunteer work with charities. Leave the business side of things to people who understand it. The condescension was breathtaking. Marcus genuinely believed he was offering me salvation from a life of financial struggle, never suspecting that my monthly investment income exceeded his annual salary. And if something happens to you? If we divorce? Then what happens to my financial security? Marcus waved dismissively. The prenup covers that. Mother made sure you'd be taken care of. $200,000. That was his idea of being taken care of. Less than I spent on a single piece of art at last month's Sotheby's auction. I see. I stood up, gathering my purse. Well, I suppose we'll find out what happens next when your mother's lawyers finally produce their disclosure documents. Emma, wait. Marcus caught my hand, his eyes finally showing genuine concern. You're not going to do anything to embarrass the family at the engagement party, are you? The question revealed how little he trusted me, how convinced he was that I was an outsider who might cause problems for his precious family reputation. I'm not planning to embarrass anyone, I said truthfully. I'm just planning to be completely honest about who I am. That evening, I received an emergency call from Jonathan. Margaret's attorney had finally produced the Blackwell family financial disclosure, and the results were even more revealing than my private investigator had suggested. They're leveraged to their eyeballs, Jonathan reported, papers rustling in the background. The $37 million inheritance Marcus is supposed to receive? That assumes property values that haven't been accurate since 2008, and it's secured against loans that are coming due in the next 5 years. I pulled up the documents on my secure tablet, noting the creative accounting that painted their financial picture in the most optimistic possible light. The Hamptons house was valued at $12 million, but carried a mortgage of $8.5 million. The Manhattan apartment wasn't owned at all. It was a long-term rental that would cost over $3 million in remaining lease payments. What's the actual liquid net worth? I asked. Maybe $4 million, assuming they could sell everything at current market prices and pay off all debts. And that's before taxes, $4 million. Less than a third of my trust fund, and that was their entire family fortune accumulated over 5 generations. There's something else, Jonathan continued. Marcus's father's investment firm is in serious trouble. They lost their 2 biggest clients this year, and there are rumors about an SEC investigation into some of their trading practices. The picture was becoming even clearer. The Blackwells weren't just less wealthy than they pretended. They were facing potential financial ruin within the next few years. The prenup wasn't about protecting their wealth from a gold digger. It was about ensuring that when their house of cards collapsed, they wouldn't have to share the liability with a spouse who might have legal claims on their remaining assets. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Honestly, walk away. This family is headed for bankruptcy, and they're trying to trap you into a marriage where you'd have no legal recourse when everything falls apart." I thought about Marcus's condescending smile, his assumption that I should be grateful for their crumbs, about Margaret's casual cruelty and her certainty that I was beneath their social class. "Jonathan, I want you to prepare my complete financial disclosure for tomorrow's meeting." "What meeting?" "The one I'm calling with Margaret and her lawyers. It's time they learned exactly who they're dealing with." "Emma, are you sure about this? Once they know about your wealth, everything changes." "Everything already changed when they decided to treat me like a fortune hunter who should be grateful for their scraps." The next morning, I called Margaret directly, my tone crisp and professional. "Margaret, I think it's time we met to discuss the prenup terms face to face." "Well, I suppose that could be arranged," she replied, clearly struggling to maintain her usual commanding tone. "Though I should warn you that our family's financial affairs are quite complex." "I'm sure they are. Would this afternoon work?" "I'd like to bring my attorney." There was a pause. "Your attorney? Is that really necessary for such a straightforward discussion?" "Given the complexity you mentioned, I think professional representation would be wise for both parties." We agreed to meet at 4 o'clock at the Blackwell family attorney's office in Midtown. I spent the rest of the morning preparing for what would either be the most satisfying hour of my life or the end of my relationship with Marcus. Patricia met me outside the law firm's building, carrying a briefcase that contained enough financial documentation to choke a federal auditor. "Are you absolutely certain about this approach?" she asked as we rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. "They've had 2 months to treat me with basic human dignity," I replied. "Instead, they've assumed I'm a gold digger who should be grateful for whatever they decide to give me. It's time they learned the cost of those assumptions." Margaret was already seated in the conference room when we arrived, flanked by 2 attorneys who looked like they'd stepped out of a 1950s legal drama. Her expression was carefully composed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Emma, dear," she said with forced warmth, "and this must be your lawyer?" "Jonathan Rivers," he introduced himself, setting his briefcase on the polished table. "I handle Emma's family's legal affairs." One of Margaret's attorneys leaned forward. "I'm Richard Morrison, senior partner here at Morrison, Kessler and Associates. I understand there are some concerns about the prenuptial agreement terms?" "Not concerns exactly," Jonathan replied smoothly. "More a question of whether the terms are based on accurate information about both parties' financial situations." Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I can assure you that our family's financial disclosure is completely accurate and comprehensive." "I'm sure it is," I said, accepting the thick folder one of her lawyers slid across the table. "And in the spirit of complete transparency, I've prepared my own disclosure as well." The room fell silent as Patricia opened her briefcase and began arranging documents. 3 separate financial statements, each bound in expensive leather covers, asset verification from multiple banks, property deeds, investment portfolio summaries. Margaret's eyes widened as the papers kept coming. "This seems extensive for someone in your circumstances." "My circumstances are probably different than you assumed," I replied calmly. Jonathan had prepared a single-page summary sheet that told the story in stark numbers. I watched Margaret's face as her gaze moved down the column of figures, her composed expression slowly giving way to shock. "This can't be accurate," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Which part?" I asked pleasantly. Margaret's attorney leaned over to read the summary, his face paling as he processed the numbers. Miss Chen, are you saying you currently have assets worth over $15 million? $15.3 million as of yesterday's market close, Patricia confirmed. Though with the tech sector rally, that number changes daily. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret stared at the documents as if they might spontaneously combust, while her lawyers frantically flipped through pages of supporting documentation. There must be some mistake, Margaret said weakly. No mistake, Jonathan replied. Emma's grandmother was Jennifer Chang, one of the early investors in what became Google, Apple, and Amazon. The trust fund she established has been performing exceptionally well. I watched understanding dawn on Margaret's face, followed quickly by horror as she realized the implications. She'd spent 2 months treating a woman worth $15 million like a desperate gold digger, demanding she sign a prenup that offered her pocket change in exchange for marriage to her chronically underemployed son. But you work at a bookstore, Margaret stammered. I work at a bookstore because I enjoy books and meeting people, I replied, not because I need the money. And the apartment, your clothes, your car. I prefer living modestly. It helps me avoid exactly the kind of assumptions you've been making about my character and motivations. Margaret's carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. Everything she thought she knew about her family's superior social position, about her son's desirability as a husband, about her own right to dictate terms to his fiancé, was being systematically demolished by a stack of financial documents. This changes everything, she whispered. Does it? I asked. Why should my financial situation change anything about our relationship? Margaret opened and closed her mouth several times before managing to speak. Well, obviously the prenup terms would need to be reconsidered. Would they? Last week you told me these were standard terms for someone in my position. Has my position actually changed? Or have you simply learned something about me that you never bothered to ask? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret had never inquired about my family, my background, or my education beyond what she could observe during our few interactions. She'd made assumptions based entirely on appearances and Marcus's limited information. Perhaps we should discuss revised terms, Richard Morrison suggested diplomatically. What kind of revisions? Jonathan asked. The lawyers began discussing technical terms and precedents, but I was watching Margaret's face as she processed the complete reversal of her assumptions. She'd built her entire approach to our relationship on the belief that she held all the cards, that I was a supplicant who should be grateful for her family's acceptance. Now she was learning that not only was I wealthier than her entire family, but that I'd allowed her to treat me with condescension and barely concealed contempt for months while possessing the financial power to buy and sell their precious family legacy several times over. Emma, Margaret said suddenly, interrupting the lawyer's discussion. I think perhaps we should discuss this privately. Actually, I replied, gathering the papers, I think I need some time to consider whether this prenup is even necessary. Margaret's face went white. What do you mean? I mean that when I agreed to marry Marcus, I thought I was joining a family that valued character over bank statements. A family that would welcome someone based on their treatment of their son, not their net worth. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. Learning that your acceptance was conditional on your assumptions about my finances makes me question what kind of family I'd actually be joining. Emma, please, Margaret said, rising from her chair. I think there's been a misunderstanding, has there? Because from where I sit, it seems like you understood perfectly. You assumed I was poor, desperate, and grateful. You treated me accordingly. The only misunderstanding was your assumption itself. I could see panic flickering behind Margaret's eyes as she realized that her months of condescension might have cost her family access to wealth that dwarfed their own. Perhaps we could start over, she suggested weakly. Could we? Because I have to wonder, if Marcus and I do marry, and your family faces financial difficulties in the future, would I be expected to bail you out? After all, I'd be family then, with all the financial obligations that apparently entails. Margaret's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. They'd obviously briefed her on the family's actual financial situation, and the prospect of having a wealthy daughter-in-law must have looked like salvation rather than threat. That's not— We would never— Margaret began, but couldn't finish the thought. I need to think about this, I said, heading for the door. About whether I want to marry into a family that judges people by their bank accounts rather than their character. As we left the law office, Patricia shook her head in amazement. I've seen a lot of prenup negotiations, but I've never seen someone's entire worldview collapse in real time like that. She brought it on herself, I replied. Every condescending comment, every assumption, every moment she made me feel like I should be grateful for their acceptance. It all led to this. My phone was buzzing with calls from Marcus, probably summoned by his mother's frantic reports from the meeting. I ignored them, needing time to process what had just happened and what came next. The engagement party was tomorrow night. 200 of the Blackwells' closest friends and business associates would be gathering to celebrate Marcus's engagement to the woman they thought was a poor graduate student, who'd somehow managed to snare their precious heir. Instead, they were about to meet a woman who could buy their host's entire lifestyle with her quarterly dividend payments. The revelation would shatter more than just Margaret's assumptions. It would force their entire social circle to confront their own prejudices about wealth, class, and what actually made someone worthy of respect. I had 24 hours to decide whether I wanted to proceed with that revelation, and whether I still wanted to marry Marcus after learning exactly how his family viewed our relationship. The game had changed completely, and for the first time since this whole charade began, I wasn't entirely sure how I wanted it to end. The morning of the engagement party arrived with 17 missed calls from Marcus, 12 voicemails from Margaret, and a series of increasingly frantic text messages that chronicled their family's complete panic in real time. I sat in my real apartment, sipping coffee that cost more per pound than Marcus made in a week, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan in shades of gold. Today would either be the most satisfying social event of my life, or the spectacular end of a relationship that had been built on fundamental deceptions from both sides. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus himself, standing in my building's lobby according to the doorman's call. Send him up, I told the doorman, curious to see which version of Marcus would appear. The condescending fiancé who thought he was rescuing me from poverty, or something closer to the man I'd thought I was falling in love with 2 years ago. Marcus knocked softly, then used the spare key I'd given him months ago. He stepped inside and stopped short, his eyes widening as he took in my apartment for the first time. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the carefully curated art collection, the furniture that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. This isn't the apartment you showed me, he said slowly. No, it isn't. This is where I actually live. Marcus walked through the space like a man in a dream, touching surfaces that clearly cost more than his monthly salary. He paused in front of a small Monet sketch, original and worth more than his car. Emma, I don't understand any of this. What don't you understand? He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been betrayal. Mother told me about yesterday's meeting, about your financial situation, but this apartment, these things. Why did you lie to me? The question hung between us, loaded with implications that cut both ways. When exactly did I lie to you, Marcus? You let me believe you were poor, struggling, that you needed what my family could provide. I set down my coffee cup, studying the man I'd agreed to marry. Did I tell you I was poor, or did you assume it because I work retail and live modestly? Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing, but now recognized as his default response to any situation requiring actual thought. You never corrected my assumptions. Did you ever ask? In 2 years of dating, did you once inquire about my family background, my education before graduate school, my long-term financial goals, or anything else that might have given you a more complete picture of who I am? The silence stretched between us, answering the question more clearly than words could have. I assumed, Marcus said finally. You assumed because it fit the narrative you wanted. The successful businessman rescuing the struggling student. It made you feel important, didn't it? Generous? Like you were doing something noble by loving someone beneath your social class? Marcus flinched as if I'd slapped him. I never thought of it that way, didn't you? Because when your mother presented that prenup, when she talked about protecting the family fortune from potential complications, you didn't defend me. You didn't question whether the terms were fair or whether I deserved better treatment. You just assumed I should be grateful for whatever scraps your family decided to throw my way. He sank into one of my chairs, a piece that had been handcrafted by a furniture maker whose waiting list was 3 years long. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was sitting on something worth more than the settlement his mother's prenup had offered. So what happens now? He asked. I considered the question carefully. The engagement party was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock at the Union Club, one of Manhattan's most exclusive social venues. 200 guests were expecting to meet Marcus's fiancé, the graduate student who'd somehow captured the heart of the Blackwell heir. That depends, I said. Do you want to marry me because you love who I am? Or because you love who you thought I was? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city view that my apartment commanded. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know anymore. I don't know who you really are. I'm exactly who I've always been, Marcus. I'm the woman who listened to your dreams about expanding your father's business internationally. The one who suggested the merger strategies you presented as your own ideas. The one who supported you through your anxiety about never living up to your father's expectations. I moved to stand beside his chair, looking down at him as he wrestled with concepts that should have been simple. I'm also the woman your mother spent 2 months treating like a potential threat to your family's financial security, never bothering to learn anything real about me beyond what she could observe during our few interactions. She was protecting our family. From what? From someone who actually cared about you rather than your bank account. Because that's exactly what she accomplished. She drove away someone who loved you for who you are, not what you could provide. Marcus looked up at me, and I could see the exact moment he understood the full scope of what his family had lost through their assumptions and prejudices. The engagement party, he said, is still happening. The question is whether you want me there as your fiancé or as a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging people by their appearances. My phone rang before Marcus could respond. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and I answered it on speaker. Emma, dear. Margaret's voice was strained with false cheerfulness. I was hoping we could speak before this evening's festivities. We're speaking now. Well, yes, but I meant in person. Perhaps we could meet for lunch. I feel there may have been some misunderstandings that we should clear up before tonight. I exchanged glances with Marcus, who looked like a man watching his life implode in slow motion. What kind of misunderstandings? Oh, family dynamics can be so complicated. I may have been overly cautious about the prenup situation. Perhaps we could discuss revised terms that better reflect everyone's actual circumstances. The desperation in Margaret's voice was almost painful to hear. The woman who had spent months making me feel like an interloper was now practically begging for a chance to undo the damage her assumptions had caused. Margaret, do you remember what you said about fortune hunters when you first presented the prenup? There was a pause. I may have used some unfortunate terminology. You said you couldn't risk fortune hunters attempting to claim what generations of Blackwells had built. You made it clear that you saw me as a potential threat to your family's financial security. I was simply being prudent. You were being prejudiced, I interrupted. You looked at me and saw someone you could dismiss and control, someone who should be grateful for whatever your family decided to offer. Marcus winced at my words, probably recognizing his own behavior in his mother's actions. Emma, please, Margaret continued. Can we at least discuss this before the party? I have 200 guests, expecting to celebrate Marcus's engagement. Then, I suppose you should have thought about that before you spent 2 months insulting your future daughter-in-law. Ended the call and turned back to Marcus, who was staring at his phone as if it might provide answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. She's terrified, he said. Of what? Of losing access to wealth she never had any right to expect? Of losing you? Of losing what you could bring to the family? I sat across from him, noting how different this conversation felt from all our previous discussions about his family's treatment of me. For the first time, Marcus seemed to be grasping the actual dynamics at play rather than the fantasy version he'd constructed. Marcus, let me ask you something. If I were actually the poor graduate student your mother assumed I was, would her treatment of me have been acceptable? He started to answer, then stopped, clearly realizing the trap in the question. I mean, the prenup terms would have been different. That's not what I asked. If I were poor, would it have been acceptable for your mother to treat me with condescension and barely concealed contempt? Would it have been reasonable for her to assume I was only interested in your money? Marcus struggled with the question, and I could see him trying to reconcile his family's behavior with any reasonable standard of human decency. She was protecting what she thought was a vulnerable family legacy, he said finally, by attacking someone she perceived as vulnerable herself. Do you see the problem with that logic? Before Marcus could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from my private investigator. David had been monitoring the Blackwell family's activities since yesterday's revelation, and his update painted a picture of a family in complete crisis. Margaret had spent the morning calling every major law firm in Manhattan, trying to find someone who could help her navigate the disaster she'd created. Marcus's father had emergency meetings with their accountants and investment advisors, presumably trying to figure out how to position their financial difficulties in light of their future daughter-in-law's unexpected wealth. Most tellingly, they'd already started reaching out to their social circle, testing how to frame the evening's revelations. According to David's sources, Margaret was planning to present my wealth as a delightful surprise that the family had known about all along, rather than admitting her months of condescension had been based on fundamental misconceptions. They're trying to rewrite history, I told Marcus, showing him David's report. Marcus read the messages, his face growing paler with each detail. Mother's already telling people that we always knew about your family's success in technology? Apparently, your parents are concerned about how their social circle will react to learning they've been treating someone wealthier than themselves like a charity case. This is insane, Marcus muttered. The whole situation has become completely insane. I watched him process the full scope of his family's deception, both of me and of their friends. The Blackwells weren't just dealing with the embarrassment of having misjudged my financial situation. They were facing the complete collapse of their carefully constructed social persona. Marcus, I need you to understand something. Tonight's party will happen one way or another. Your mother has already committed to hosting 200 people at one of the most expensive venues in Manhattan. The question is, what story gets told when I walk into that room? He looked up at me, and I could see genuine fear in his eyes for the first time since I'd known him. What do you mean? I mean, I could walk in as your loving fiancé who's excited to officially join the family that's welcomed me so warmly. Or I could walk in as the woman who spent 2 months being insulted by people who assumed she was beneath their notice. The choice was stark, and Marcus clearly understood the implications. His family's social standing, their business relationships, their entire carefully constructed world could be destroyed in a single evening if I decided to share the truth about how they'd treated me. "What do you want from us?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked what I wanted rather than telling me what I should want, and I found the change both encouraging and deeply sad. "I want honesty, Marcus. From you, from your family, from everyone involved in this situation." "What kind of honesty?" "The kind where you acknowledge that your family spent 2 months treating me badly because you all assumed I was after your money. The kind where your mother admits she was wrong about my character and motivations. The kind where you decide whether you want to marry me for who I am or abandon the engagement because you can't handle the truth about who I've been all along." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with concepts that challenged everything he'd believed about his family's superiority and his own judgment. "And if we're honest, if we acknowledge the mistakes and apologize, what then? Then we see whether there's anything real left between us after we strip away all the assumptions and deceptions." My phone rang again, this time showing Jonathan's number. "Emma, I've been fielding calls all morning from Morrison, Kessler and Associates," he reported. "Margaret Blackwell's attorneys want to discuss completely restructuring the prenup terms." "How completely?" "They're now proposing that you receive 50% of all marital assets in case of divorce, plus full protection for your separate property and business interests." "It's actually a fairly generous agreement." I glanced at Marcus, who was listening to every word with growing understanding of how thoroughly his family's position had shifted overnight. "And if I decline the new terms? Then technically, you'd be entering the marriage with no financial protection at all, which would give you significant advantages under New York divorce law." The irony was perfect. Margaret's original prenup had been designed to limit my financial claims on the family fortune. Now that she knew about my actual wealth, she was desperate to limit my potential claims on their assets that were worth less than my quarterly dividend payments. "I'll call you back," I told Jonathan, then turned to Marcus. "Your mother is now offering me 50% of your family's assets if we divorce." Marcus's face went through several expressions before settling on something resembling understanding. "Because she's realized that without a prenup, you could potentially claim much more. Or because she's realized that treating wealthy people badly can have expensive consequences." I stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city where the Blackwell family was currently scrambling to undo months of damage with a few hours of frantic phone calls. "Marcus, I'm going to give you a choice. We can go to tonight's party together, present a united front, and try to build something real from the wreckage of all these assumptions and deceptions. Or we can end this engagement now, before your family has a chance to embarrass themselves further in front of 200 witnesses. What would you prefer?" "I'd prefer to have had this conversation 2 years ago, before I wasted time falling in love with someone who didn't bother to learn who I really was." The words hung between us, carrying the weight of everything that had gone wrong and everything that might still be salvaged. Marcus stood and moved to stand beside me at the window, both of us looking down at the city that contained all the people who would be gathering tonight to celebrate what might be either a beginning or an ending. "I love you," he said quietly. "I think I love the real you even more than the version I thought I knew. Do you?" Or do you love the idea that you're marrying someone wealthier than your family expected? It was a harsh question, but a necessary one. Marcus needed to confront his own motivations as honestly as I was confronting mine. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know how to separate my feelings from everything I've learned about money and status, and what makes someone worth loving. The honesty was brutal and refreshing in equal measure. Then maybe, I said, it's time you learned the sea. Union Club's grand ballroom sparkled under crystal chandeliers, as 200 of Manhattan's social elite mingled over champagne and canapes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I stood in the ornate foyer, watching through the doorway as Margaret Blackwell worked the room with the practiced efficiency of a woman whose entire identity depended on maintaining appearances. She wore midnight blue silk that probably cost what Marcus made in a month, her diamonds catching the light as she gestured animatedly to small clusters of guests. From this distance, she looked every inch the successful society matron hosting a celebration for her beloved future daughter-in-law. The irony was exquisite. Marcus appeared beside me, adjusting his bow tie with nervous fingers. We'd spent the afternoon in careful negotiation, establishing ground rules for how the evening would unfold. He would introduce me truthfully. No lies, no embellishments, no attempts to manage the narrative. I would be gracious but honest about my background if asked directly. Last chance to change your mind, I murmured, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. About the engagement, or about telling people the truth? Both. Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying the assembled guests. Most of them had known him since childhood, had watched him grow up in the shadow of family expectations and inherited obligations. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, he said finally. About learning to separate my feelings from everything I was taught about money and status. And? I think I want to learn, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it means admitting I've been wrong about almost everything. There was something different in his voice, a quality I hadn't heard before. Not the confident charm he usually projected, but something more uncertain and therefore more genuine. Margaret spotted us from across the room and began making her way over, her smile bright enough to power the chandeliers. She'd clearly spent considerable effort preparing for this moment, probably rehearsing exactly how to present the evening's revelations in the most favorable light possible. Emma, darling, she gushed, air kissing my cheeks with theatrical warmth. You look absolutely stunning. That dress is divine. The dress was indeed divine. A custom creation from a designer whose pieces started at more than Margaret's monthly household budget. I'd chosen it specifically to send a message, elegant enough to fit seamlessly into their social circle, while expensive enough to hint at depths they hadn't suspected. Thank you, Margaret. You've certainly created a beautiful evening. Well, nothing's too good for my future daughter-in-law, she replied, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to overhear. I'm so excited for everyone to finally meet the brilliant woman who's captured Marcus's heart. The performance was flawless, complete with genuine-sounding maternal affection. If I hadn't spent 2 months experiencing Margaret's actual opinion of me, I might have been convinced by her act. Shall we? Marcus offered his arm, and we moved into the ballroom proper. The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Margaret introduced me to wave after wave of Manhattan's social elite, each introduction accompanied by carefully edited information about my background. I was a graduate student at Columbia, yes, but she somehow forgot to mention my retail job. My family had been successful in technology, she explained vaguely. Without specifying the scale of that success, I played along, answering questions about my studies and my interests while watching Margaret navigate the delicate balance between presenting me as worthy of her family and maintaining her own sense of superiority. It was masterful social manipulation, and I found myself almost admiring her skill even as I planned to demolish it. The turning point came when Harrison Whitmore, a prominent investment banker who'd known the Blackwell family for decades, pulled Marcus aside for what appeared to be a serious conversation. I watched from across the room as Whitmore's expression shifted from casual interest to genuine surprise, to something approaching concern. "Emma, dear," Margaret appeared at my elbow, her smile now looking slightly strained. "Perhaps we should mingle with some of the younger crowd. I'd love for you to meet the daughters of some of our oldest friends." But it was too late. I could see the whispered conversations spreading through the room like ripples in a pond. Whitmore had clearly shared some version of what he'd learned about my family's wealth, and the information was making its way through the social network with the efficiency of a well-oiled gossip machine. Within minutes, the dynamic in the room shifted perceptibly. Conversations became more animated, glances more frequent, and the quality of attention directed toward me changed from polite interest to genuine curiosity. Mrs. Blackwell, a silver-haired woman in emeralds, approached our group. "I was just speaking with Harrison about Emma's family. The Chang technology fortune, how fascinating. Your Marcus has certainly made an interesting choice." Margaret's smile became brittle around the edges. "Well, as I always say, love is the most important foundation for any marriage." "Of course," the woman agreed, her eyes glittering with the satisfaction of someone who'd just acquired particularly juicy social intelligence, though it certainly doesn't hurt when both families bring such substantial resources to the union. I watched Margaret struggle with how to respond. Agreeing would require her to admit she'd known about my wealth all along, which would raise uncomfortable questions about her recent behavior. Disagreeing would mean publicly acknowledging that she'd been ignorant of her future daughter-in-law's background. "Emma's family has been quite private about their success," Margaret said finally, choosing a middle path that satisfied no one. "How refreshing," another guest chimed in. "So rare to find truly wealthy families who aren't constantly displaying their good fortune." "Your Emma must have inherited admirable discretion along with her inheritance." The word inheritance hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret's carefully constructed narrative was crumbling as the guest's own assumptions and calculations took over. Marcus returned to my side, his face pale. "We need to talk," he murmured, having second thoughts. I asked quietly. "Harrison just told me that your family's wealth makes ours look like pocket change." "Is that true?" The moment of reckoning had arrived sooner than expected. Around us, conversations continued, but I could feel the undercurrent of attention focused on our small drama. "Does it matter?" I replied. "I don't know. Maybe. Probably." Marcus ran his hand through his hair, disrupting his carefully styled appearance. "I'm trying to figure out if I'm more upset that you didn't tell me or that I never bothered to ask." "And what conclusion are you reaching?" Before Marcus could answer, Margaret stepped between us, her social smile now completely abandoned in favor of barely controlled panic. "Emma, perhaps we could speak privately for a moment? I think we're past private conversations, don't you?" Margaret glanced around the room, noting the not-so-subtle eavesdropping happening around us. Her months of social maneuvering were about to be exposed in front of everyone who mattered in her carefully constructed world. "Please," she whispered. "I know I made mistakes, but this doesn't have to become a public spectacle, doesn't it?" I accepted another glass of champagne from a passing waiter, noting how the server's eyes widened slightly in recognition. Even the staff were beginning to understand that something significant was unfolding. "You invited 200 people to celebrate an engagement based on assumptions about my background and character. Assumptions that were completely wrong. What exactly did you expect to happen when the truth came out? A small crowd was gathering around us now, no longer pretending to have separate conversations. The Blackwell family drama was becoming the evening's entertainment, and I could see Margaret's carefully constructed social persona beginning to crack under the pressure. I may have been overly cautious about protecting family interests, Margaret said, her voice carrying to the expanding audience. But surely you can understand a mother's concern for her son's future. I can understand concern, I replied evenly. What I have trouble understanding is spending 2 months treating someone with condescension and contempt without bothering to learn anything real about them. The crowd was completely silent now, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a typical engagement announcement. Margaret's face had gone white, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the panic in her eyes. Perhaps, interrupted a voice from the crowd, someone should explain exactly what's happening here. The speaker was Victoria Ashworth, the social columnist whose weekly pieces could make or destroy reputations in Manhattan's elite circles. She held her phone discreetly, probably recording every word for her next column. Margaret looked around desperately, clearly realizing that her attempt to control the narrative had failed completely. Victoria, darling, she began, but I cut her off. What's happening is quite simple, I said, turning to address the entire gathering. 2 months ago, Margaret presented me with a prenuptial agreement designed to protect the Blackwell family fortune from what she assumed was a gold-digging graduate student. The terms offered me a maximum of $200,000 in case of divorce, regardless of circumstances or duration of marriage. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. $200,000 was pocket change to most of the people in this room, an insultingly small amount for someone marrying into what they'd assumed was substantial wealth. The problem, I continued, is that Margaret never bothered to inquire about my actual background or financial situation. If she had, she would have discovered that my trust fund is currently worth approximately $15.3 million. The silence that followed was absolute. I could practically hear the mental calculations happening as Manhattan's social elite processed the complete reversal of their assumptions about the evening's power dynamics. Margaret swayed slightly, gripping Marcus's arm for support. Her months of treating me like an inferior had just been exposed as not only cruel but spectacularly ignorant. Furthermore, I added, enjoying the stunned expressions around me, my family's investigation into the Blackwell finances revealed that their actual liquid net worth is approximately $4 million, most of which is leveraged against properties that haven't been accurately appraised in years. Now, the gasps weren't polite social commentary. They were genuine shock. The Blackwells' financial situation had been an open secret in some circles, but having it publicly acknowledged at their own engagement party was social suicide. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been admiration. "Emma's right," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. My family made assumptions based on appearances and acted on those assumptions without ever bothering to learn who Emma really was. We were wrong. Completely, embarrassingly wrong. Margaret turned to her son with an expression of absolute betrayal. "Marcus, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "Emma deserves better than the way we've treated her. She deserved better from the beginning, regardless of her financial situation." I studied Marcus's face, looking for signs that this public declaration was another calculated move. But his eyes held something I'd rarely seen before, genuine regret mixed with what appeared to be actual respect. "The question now," I said, addressing the still silent crowd, "is whether this engagement represents the beginning of something honest and equitable, or whether it's time to end a relationship built on fundamental misunderstandings." All eyes turned to Marcus, waiting for his response. His next words would determine not only the fate of our relationship, but also his family's social standing and business relationships throughout Manhattan. Marcus took a deep breath, looking around the room at faces that had watched him grow up, that had expected him to marry appropriately and continue the family legacy according to their established social rules. "Emma," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I love you. Not because of your money, not despite your money, but because of who you are when all the assumptions and expectations get stripped away. If you'll still have me, knowing that I have a lot to learn about treating people with the respect they deserve regardless of their bank accounts, I'd like to try to be the kind of man who's actually worthy of you." The crowd held its collective breath as I considered his words. Around us, 200 of Manhattan's most influential people waited to see whether this would be a fairy tale ending or a spectacular social disaster. I thought about the past 2 months of subtle humiliations and casual cruelties, about Margaret's condescending smiles, and Marcus's assumption that I should be grateful for whatever his family offered, about the prenup that had valued my potential contribution to their family at less than the cost of my monthly car payment. But I also thought about Marcus's admission that he needed to learn, his public acknowledgement that his family had been wrong, and the possibility that something genuine might be built from the wreckage of all these revealed deceptions. "Marcus," I said finally, "I'll marry you on one condition." "What condition?" I smiled, noting the mixture of hope and terror in his eyes. "No prenup at all. If we're going to do this, we do it as equal partners in everything. Your assets, my assets, our shared future. All of it gets combined into one life we build together." Margaret made a small choking sound, clearly realizing that this arrangement would give me legal access to whatever remained of the Blackwell fortune while offering them no protection against my substantially larger wealth. Marcus looked at his mother, then back at me, his expression showing the exact moment he understood the magnitude of what I was proposing. "You'd trust me with that kind of legal vulnerability?" he asked. "I'd trust you to learn that love isn't about protecting yourself from the person you're supposed to share your life with." Marcus stepped forward and took my hands, his grip warm and steady despite the social earthquake we'd just triggered. "Then yes, no prenup. Equal partners in everything." The crowd erupted in applause, though I suspected it was more for the spectacle they'd witnessed than for the romantic resolution. Around us, conversations immediately resumed at a fever pitch as everyone began processing the evening's revelations and their implications for Manhattan's social hierarchy. Margaret stood frozen in the center of the chaos, watching her carefully planned engagement party transform into the most talked-about social event of the year for all the wrong reasons. "Well," Victoria Ashworth said, appearing at my elbow with her phone still recording, "this will certainly make for an interesting column." As the party continued around us, Marcus and I found ourselves in a quiet corner, both of us trying to process what had just happened. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now we find out if we can build something real from all this honesty," I replied, "though I suspect your mother may need some time to adjust to the new family dynamics." Marcus glanced over at Margaret, who was being consoled by a group of friends while trying to maintain what remained of her dignity. "She'll adapt," he said. "She'll have to. The alternative is losing us both, and I don't think she's prepared for that kind of social exile." I thought about Margaret's options and realized Marcus was probably right. In Manhattan's interconnected social circles, being cut off from a family with $15 million was far more damaging than swallowing one's pride and accepting a new reality. "Do you think we can make this work?" Marcus asked. I looked around the ballroom, at the guests who were still buzzing with excitement about the evening's drama, At Margaret, who was beginning to understand that her future comfort might depend on treating me with genuine respect. At Marcus, who had finally seen himself clearly enough to want to change. I think, I said, we're about to find out. The engagement party continued for another 2 hours. But the real celebration had already begun. Not the artificial performance Margaret had orchestrated, but the messy, honest, complicated beginning of whatever Marcus and I might build together without the burden of assumptions, deceptions, or prenups designed to protect us from each other. As we left the Union Club that night, Marcus took my hand and looked back at the building where his family's social persona had been simultaneously destroyed and reconstructed in the span of a single conversation. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about the question seriously, considering all the ways the evening could have unfolded differently. "Only one," I replied. "I wish we'd had this conversation 2 years ago." Marcus squeezed my hand as we walked into the Manhattan night, both of us finally free to discover who we might become when we stopped pretending to be who everyone else expected us to be. Behind us, the Union Club's windows glowed with warm light as the remaining guests continued dissecting the most honest engagement party in Manhattan social history. And somewhere in that room, Margaret Blackwell was probably planning her next move in a game where all the rules had just changed completely. But that was tomorrow's challenge. Tonight was about beginnings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.